Hello, Blake Veneer here again with another part of this series where we're going to be looking at how an Aether model can be used to solve some of the unexplained issues in our current understanding of physics. Last time we talked about our current limitations in our interpretations in the fundamental physics and how that has kind of led us to a dead end. And I also reviewed how we can use, or how important the galaxy rotation curves and their discrepancy with experiment and data theoretical predictions are. And so we also looked at how why Aether models make sense. But this is going to be a little bit more focused on why and why not Aether models. So what we're going to talk about is currently why Aether models have been shut down over the past. Then we're going to review a few more points that I reviewed just to add on some of the reasons why I'm a big proponent for an Aether model. And then I want to talk about why general relativity is really not a solution to gravity. And then, in my opinion, what the biggest challenges with an Aether model are. So why not Aether? Over the years, Aether has been a pretty popular idea, especially because we wanted to talk about light moving through a medium, and mostly a lot to do with Maxwell's equations, because Maxwell's equations said that the speed of light had to be constant. Okay, so by the 1800s, well, late 1800s, there and about, but the requirements of Aether were essentially that it had to be incredibly rigid to propagate light. It had to be massless and without viscosity as to not affect the orbits of the planet. It had to be completely transparent, non-dispersive, incompressible, and continuous at a very small scale. So whether I agree or disagree with a lot of these, we will talk about that later. But there's a lot on its plate right now. So Michelson-Morley is one of our first experiments that started to shoot down Aether. It was trying to measure the Aether wind. And so if we had some sort of source, it would go into an interferometer, bounce off a mirror, come back, then the other leg would bounce off the mirror, come back, and then the output would be seen by some sort of eye or camera. And so essentially, this would be rotated. And if there was an Aether wind, maybe going in that direction, it would, as this apparatus was rotated through the Aether wind, the amount of time light would take to travel down one leg would vary compared to the next. And so we would see some sort of shifting in the Aether or in the interference pattern of the light. There was a null result here. And so that meant that Aether must be dragged along with Earth. Many more experiments later with a lot more precision were carried out, and they all confirmed the same thing, that there's no, there was not any sort of Aether wind measured. So if Aether's being dragged by the Earth, well, clearly then it would be dragged by the rotation. So as the Earth spun. So the Michelson-Gale-Pearson experiment was another interferometer, but this is a ring interferometer, quite a bit larger. And so our source here, go into a beam splitter, one light path like that, and then another light path. Well, basically the light was going in opposite directions. They would combine, and another eyeball. And if this apparatus is rotating, the path lengths are different for light, and so you would measure an interference pattern. Or not interference, but the interference pattern or the fringes would adjust according to the rotation of the planet. And what they found is that indeed they were able to calculate the rotation of the Earth, and that agreed very closely with what the astronomy values were by looking at the stars. So basically, Aether was not being dragged according to this experiment. So this is a problem. We got two conflicting results. Some of the other experiments we did were another interferometer. And they would add some masses maybe around one leg. And the hope there was that by adding a whole bunch of mass along one leg, you would create a Aether dragging kind of effect, and that would change the interference or the fringes or create a phase shift. And basically that was also a null result. So the stellar aberrations due to Aether, we have stellar aberrations due to the motion of the Earth. And that makes sense, but what they are assuming is that if Earth is here and there's some sort of Aether that's dragged, they're imagining that if light's coming in this direction, there's going to be some sort of angle, or the light path direction is going to change due to this sort of moving Aether. That has never been detected. And then Veltman also, so there was a lot of thoughts in the past. This is probably going back to the 1800s. I can't remember the date exactly, or thereabouts, but they were looking at the index of refraction. So if this was a moving medium and it had an index of refraction, you could calculate the phase shift due to the motion of that medium. Well, Veltman showed experimentally, I believe, and so if somebody wants to confirm that the index of refraction was wavelength dependent. So the argument there was that if it's wavelength dependent, then as light traveled through these moving bits of or chain, variable n, or the index of refractions due to Aether, you would get some sort of prism-like diffraction or of the of white light, and we don't see that either. But the issue here that I'm trying to point out is that this was experimentally verified for things that we work with, such as glass and whatnot. It wasn't actually theoretically proven for an Aether. So I don't know if this one actually pertains to any solid counter argument. Now, Einstein really did a number on Aether theories with two new concepts, and that is first, special relativity. So with special relativity, since the speed of light or all motion is relative and the speed of light is always constant for your particular frame, we basically got rid of the need to have a universal reference frame for the speed of light, and that's mostly for the Maxwell's equations, and also he explained the photoelectric effect as light behaving as particles, and if light behaves as a particle, then it doesn't need a medium. Moving on from that, and here I'm just going to come back to virtual particles and exchange forces again. I mentioned this in the previous video, but just want to touch on a little bit more and why it makes sense for Aether models. Now, virtual particles, I tend to think about these a lot. Mostly I was growing up reading a lot of the books just trying to explain quantum mechanics and whatnot. And one of the things that they always talked about is virtual particles forming out of the vacuum briefly and then annihilating themselves. And so you have, a delta E equals 0. So basically you borrow energy from the vacuum to form, and then you annihilate yourself. And it's like it never happened. My problem, especially for this, is that it doesn't make sense when you think of photons, because a photon is its antiparticle, and it's just energy and momentum. And so you can't really cancel out energy and momentum with more energy and momentum. So, I just saw a video with Sabina talking about this, and really what virtual particles are more just for the math and integrals, right? So, whether they actually exist is probably a larger discussion. However, you can think of virtual particles instead of actual particles that are forming out of the nothingness briefly as just oscillations in a medium. So imagine you take a medium and you distort it one direction, you could have an equal and opposite, and that could briefly creates fields that act like particles, and then the next moment they cancel back to nothing. And so if you think of, Aether as being just the fabric of space-time or whatever, you could just, these would just be like very small oscillations and fluctuations in this background medium, and not actual particles forming out of the nothingness. And then again with exchange forces, last time we talked about how, the interpretation of handing off particles directly with each other, or exchanging virtual particles, is kind of confusing and weird, and especially if you're trying to explain attraction. But here's one of the bigger arguments that I like, is that imagine you have let's just say it's a box. In that box we have two particles, and they're separated by 60 light seconds. It's probably pretty large. Well, that is very large. But anyway, the point though is that they're going to feel something regardless. It's going to be very, very, very small. And maybe we can make that 1 light second. The ultimate value here doesn't matter, but there is just, the point is that it's some measurable, distance that the signal between the two are going to be, or could be, delayed. So if they both exist in this box, we're going to say P1 feels P2, and P2. So no problem here, right? So now let's add another box. We're going to drop both in. Oops. So anyway, so if they both get dropped in at t equals 0, I'm pretty sure everybody here would agree that P1 until, right? So basically, until there's been 60 seconds and there's enough time for the influences to travel the distance of 60 light seconds, we wouldn't know about the other. Now, if we do a final one, so P1 has been there for minus 100 seconds. P2 is dropped in at t equals 0. And so now we have P1 has already established a field. And so what I would say is P1 I'm just going to say t equals 0. I want to say that P2 at t, as soon as it's dropped in, P2 is going to feel P1. Right? And then at t equals 60 seconds, P1. Okay, so what I'm saying with all this chicken scratch is that the knowledge of P1's electric field needs to be stored in the medium or in a field that exists regardless of the existence of P2. They do not care about each other. They only care about the fields that are generated. And so I would like to say that this is another good point as why or where that field is being stored, but in some sort of Aether-like medium. Now, just another reason why I feel like it's so important for us to look at some other theories and models is because general relativity, as great as it does not tell us what gravity actually is. So you're going to want to say, but gravity is the curvature of spacetime, right? Well, GR tells us how matter will react to the curvature of spacetime. It tells us how matter curves the spacetime, and it tells us from there how matter will accelerate and move. But it doesn't explain why, other than just that we have to conserve certain properties or whatnot. But there's people like to try to explain gravity by I saw some recent videos on how it's the change in entropy or something, or it's the change in the time dilation due to gravity. Regardless, we do not talk about what is actually creating these forces and accelerations. So just to emphasize this a little bit, the rubber mat is a very popular way to describe the curvature of spacetime and gravity. And so if you have some sort of steel ball on a rubber mat, it's going to create some sort of curvature. And then if you add a little ball here, that ball is going to want to move towards the other one. Makes sense. Well, let's do the same thing. So we have a ball, steel ball. Steel is important because I'm going to add a magnet here. Boy, that curvature should be symmetric, but it's not. And that is tied to some sort of fixed point. And so now we're going to say, well, this is on Earth. And this is in space. Jeez. Okay, so we use this magnet and the string or whatever to force the curvature of space, this rubber mat, to be similar as on Earth. And now if we add a little ball here, what happens? Well, nothing. It maybe floats off in this direction. Why? No, Earth. And so what this is mostly I'm trying to point out here is that even in this simple model to explain the curvature in spacetime, you still need some sort of extra something to explain why the two forces or the two balls are attracted to each other. And gravity, and that could be gravitons or whatever it might be, but it's not covered in general relativity. And then one more point, whether this is useful to anybody else or not, but I just like to think of it is that Einstein would say that these two people maybe not just space, but more let's say flat. I don't know. Does that make sense? Who knows? Oh, geez. Flat space. And then this person here. Einstein's theory would argue that there's really no way, unless there's huge tidal forces, you're not going to really be able to tell that you're in free fall compared to flat space because you're floating unhindered in both cases. But what I want to point out is that if you have a platform here that's accelerating and you're standing on it with your arms out, there's going to be a pretty large force down. It's going to feel like there's a large force down on your arms. Now, if you were to add braces, now that force is going to feel less because you're accelerating more parts of your body. Free fall is the exact same thing. Every point of your body is being accelerated downward equally. So it might not feel like little earrings. It might not feel like you're in an accelerating free fall, but it's only because everything is being acted on the same. So we can't get around that. This is like there is like Yoda or something. So there's still that acceleration that we need to account for. I don't know, maybe that will make sense down the road, or maybe that's just a waste of time. But anyway, just that's a thought. Now, that being said, I want to talk about what I think the actual biggest challenges with an Aether model are. And the first one is Newton's first law. If you have something moving through something else, there will always be momentum transfer between the two, and they will always approach an equilibrium. And so if you have a particle moving through a medium, that particle is always going to slow down. However, if we have Aether, then we have a medium, and so we have to figure out how Aether can violate this principle somehow. And so that objects in motion can stay in motion. And so this is ultimately going to be our biggest problem that we need to focus on. Now, the other issue is the second law of thermodynamics. And so my interpretation of the second law of thermodynamics is that unique configurations will always decrease, right? So if you have a room at 20 C and you have one particle that is traveling at equivalent of 100 C in terms of just its kinetic energy, it is going to slam into the other particles, so molecules or atoms in the room, and it is going to quickly slow down and become a non-unique configuration. And so what that really looks like is if you have one particle going really fast and it's going to go into hit a cold particle, well, 99.99% of the time, that's going to be a glancing blow. And a glancing blow is a non-perfect interaction between two particles. And so you are going to have, instead of one particle with a lot of energy, now you have two particles with less energy. And then those two particles are going to have glancing blows, and you're going to have four. And so quickly, no matter what, these particles are going to become, approach equilibrium until, the interactions are the same as all the other interactions. There could be an instance where they hit perfectly on axis and it's all like 100%, transferred, but that would be one interaction. Then the next interaction is guaranteed to be a glancing blow and distribute the energy. So now, if light is a unique configuration of energy and momentum and it can travel incredible distances, this is like an Aether model is, it's hard to convince ourselves that we could use an Aether model as some sort of medium that life travels through without getting dispersed over these distances. So for now, I think we can ignore this one if we're just looking at gravity and larger bodies of motion. But, this is really more important with quantum like behavior for light. So we're going to mostly ignore it. I may come back to it later if we're looking at what an actual like photon might be. But for now, that might be a while. And so here we're going to go over the proposal. Everything is made up of spacetime particles. That's spacetime is made up of spacetime particles. Particles are made up of spacetime particles. All interactions are mediated between spacetime particles. And so therefore, all interactions are local. And this would be great talk later on Bell's inequality later, but the point here is that we're going to start with the absolute minimum of things in our universe, and that is purely just a space-time particle. We'll add things in as we need to later. Now, these are not what I'm saying. I'm sorry if I'm not giving people appropriate credit or not. I am aware that most of these ideas are likely not unique. They could have been around for hundreds of years. I'm just hoping to organize them all together and hopefully continue to make some progress forward. So if I don't reference your idea out there or somebody else's, I'm sorry. Please bring it up in the comments below and we can look at that later. But anyway, yeah, there's a lot of really smart people out there, and I'm certainly not one with all the ideas. So now, I had thought that creating, space-time particles to cover everything would be a nice start. Unfortunately, that is insanely difficult, and it turns out that addressing dark matter is one of the lower hanging fruits. So we're going to stay on a pretty high level for this first layer of understanding of some sort of Aether-like medium. And that is mostly going to be just, momentum transfer and some sort of gravity. I would hope that down the road we can start stitching in the other forces as we get into more detail later. But this series will mostly just be on super high level interactions with kind of the general the gravity like forces. So if there are other experiments that you'd like to bring up that I missed that show that Aether doesn't make any sense, please put them in the comments and I will try to address them later. As it is now, I will mostly be referencing some of the ones that I explained, and we'll reference others as needed. But if you want me to reference something specific, let me know. Our next step is the next one's kind of going to be a fun episode. We're actually going to start to come up with a really crude idea of how we're going to deal with Newton's first law and what the implications of that would be. And then we are going to, from there, we kind of need to review a lot of conceptions of how space or our physics works, because I know a lot of my adventure through physics has not been about coming up with novel thoughts, but it has been about removing some of the notions that other people have told me to have. And so I just want to help here by just breaking some of the notions that I don't think are as accurate or worth us all holding as we move forward with a more novel, unhindered model. And then after we go through a few of those, we'll start to make some sort of space-time simulation to meet the kind of needs for an Aether model. So that's it for this one. Thank you so much for paying attention. If you have comments or interest, please leave them in the comment sections below or section below. But yeah, otherwise, have a good day, and I will talk to you next time.